Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going deep on multiple sclerosis, and something we've seen popping up more and more, its relationship to intermittent fasting.
Yeah, definitely lots of buzz around that lately.
And we love to go where the listener takes us. And this time you guys sent in a really interesting mix.
Oh, yeah.
Medical websites, research articles, even some personal stories from people with MS on different forums.
Wow, so it sounds like this is something people are really thinking about.
Oh, yeah. They want to know more, and that's why we brought you on, of course.
Happy to help unpack all this great info.
So I guess the big question right out of the gate is, could what you eat really have that much of an effect on a chronic disease like MS?
Well, I think before we even get to the fasting part, we really need to understand what MS is and what it does in the body.
Makes sense. So I've got this article here, and it's talking about nerve damage in MS and something called myelin. Can you maybe explain that a little, break it down for us?
Sure. Think of your central nervous system, your brain, and spinal cord as the command center for your whole body.
Okay, yeah.
And you know how wires are coated in insulation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, myelin is kind of like that insulation for your nerves.
Oh, so it's protecting those signals.
Exactly. And in MS, the immune system actually attacks that myelin sheath.
So it's like it's stripping the wires bare.
You got it. And that leads to all sorts of different problems, all those different MS symptoms you see.
Yeah, I was just looking through these forum posts, and there's so much variety in the symptoms people describe, it's almost hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. I mean, you see vision problems, difficulty walking, just incredible fatigue.
Right, and then some of these posts talk about problems thinking clearly, even depression. It's not just physical, is it? This really affects every part of someone's life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the most challenging things for people with MS is that it can be so unpredictable, you know?
Oh yeah, how it progresses.
Exactly. Each person's experience is unique, so it makes it really hard to say how the disease is going to play out for any one person.
Okay, so these medical websites say over 1.8 million people worldwide are dealing with this, with women and young adults especially. But what causes this to happen in the first place? Is it just bad genes?
I wish it was that simple. Unfortunately, it seems to be way more complex than that. Most researchers believe it's a combination of genetics and something in the environment that triggers it.
Okay, so nature and nurture both playing a role.
Right. We don't fully understand that interplay yet, but it seems like both are involved.
Well, speaking of the environment, one of these research articles had a pretty startling stat. Heavy smokers are 5 times more likely to develop MS.
Yeah. That's one environmental factor that has a very strong link, really highlights how important lifestyle choices are.
For sure. Okay, well, I think that brings us to the big question a lot of our listeners had. Where does fasting fit into all this?
Good question, but before we get to the how, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what intermittent fasting actually is.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to do it, from what I've seen.
Absolutely. And it can get confusing. It's not just about what you eat, but when you eat.
Okay, so like this article you sent, time-restricted feeding.
Exactly. Eating only within a certain window each day.
Yeah. And then there's the 5.2 approach. Totally different.
Right. Eating normally 5 days a week, then restricting calories for 2. So lots of variations, but the core idea is using those strategic breaks from eating.
So the question is, how could that possibly affect something as complex as MS? Is there any science behind this?
There is, and it's getting really interesting. One area researchers are focusing on is the gut microbiome.
Gut bacteria, you mean?
Yep, all those trillions of bacteria living in our digestive systems.
Wait, so gut bacteria could have something to do with a neurological disease. How does that work?
Well, more and more research is showing that the gut microbiome actually plays a key role in regulating the immune system. And of course, MS is an autoimmune disease.
Oh, so it's not just about digestion.
Not at all. And inflammation, too. Seems like the gut microbiome has a big influence there as well.
So is the idea that somehow fasting is changing that gut bacteria in a good way?
That's what some studies are suggesting, that fasting might help bring those bacteria back into balance. And that, in turn, could reduce inflammation throughout the body.
Fascinating. You also flagged this study with mice that had an MS-like condition, and fasting seemed to have a really positive effect.
Yeah, it actually helped protect the myelin in those mice and reduced inflammation.
That's pretty amazing. But that's mice, right? Not people.
Exactly. Important to remember that we can't assume those same effects will translate to humans.
Right. But still, interesting to see those results. And it's not just the gut microbiome that's getting attention. There's also research on the hormonal effects of fasting, right?
You bet. Some studies have shown that fasting can boost levels of a hormone called corticosterone, and corticosterone has anti-inflammatory properties.
Okay, so we've got gut bacteria, we've got hormones. Sounds like there might be a few different ways fasting could be working here.
And it's fascinating how all these potential pathways seem to converge on that same goal, reducing inflammation, which, as we've talked about, is a major factor in MS.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what about real-world evidence? You got a whole stack of research papers here. And have there actually been any studies on intermittent fasting and MS in humans?
There have been a few, actually, small, but really intriguing. One study looked at what they called a fasting mimicking diet.
A fasting mimicking diet, what is that? Like pretend fasting?
Kind of. It's basically a very low-calorie diet, but designed to trick your body into thinking it's fasting.
Ah, interesting. So did it work? Did they see any actual benefits for people with MS?
Well, they did see some improvements in symptoms, yeah. And when they looked at the immune systems of the people in the study, they saw changes there too.
Hold on, people felt better. Like what kind of improvements? And what about their immune systems? What was going on there?
Okay, so some people said they had less fatigue, less brain fog, and those immune system changes, they suggested that inflammation was going down, like their bodies were dialing back the attack on the myelin.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But you did say these studies were small.
Right, that's the key thing. Important first steps, but we need much bigger, more rigorous studies to really confirm these findings and see if this could be a long-term strategy for managing MS.
Okay, so don't get too excited just yet. But speaking of bigger studies, you actually sent me one that's in the works. The National MS Society is funding a new study on intermittent fasting and MS with 40 people.
Yes, that one is going to be really interesting to watch. It's going to compare intermittent fasting head-to-head with a typical Western diet. So hopefully it will give us some much-needed clarity on whether this is really helpful or if there are any risks.
Okay, that's exciting. So much good research happening. But I got to ask, bottom line, for someone with MS listening right now, should they run out and start fasting?
I wouldn't recommend changing everything overnight based on what we know right now. It's just too soon to say for sure if it's safe and effective as a treatment. Promising research, for sure, but we really need more data.
So no jumping on the bandwagon just yet. But even if, down the road, the research shows real benefits, it's not like fasting is going to cure MS.
Right. It's not a cure, and it's definitely not a replacement for any existing treatment.
Okay, that's important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. If you have MS, working closely with your doctor, finding a treatment plan that's right for you, that's crucial.
And on that point, you know these forum posts you sent in, they really show how different everyone's experience can be. Some people found fasting helpful for their symptoms, but others, not so much.
Exactly. Underscores how individual the response to diet can be. What works for one person might not work for another. So yeah, that open communication with your doctor, super important.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the potential benefits and challenges, but I'm curious about the actual mechanisms at play here. You know, the science of how fasting might work on a biological level. You've got all these research papers here about autophagy. What is that exactly?
Think of your cells like little factories. They're always working, producing waste products, and autophagy is basically the cleanup crew.
Okay, so it's getting rid of the trash.
Pretty much. It gets rid of damaged parts and can actually recycle those parts for energy or to make new building blocks.
Wow, so it's like a cellular recycling program. Pretty cool.
Yeah, like spring cleaning, but on a microscopic level. And fasting seems to trigger that process.
Hold on, backing up for a second. Why would not eating make my cells clean house?
Well, when you fast, your body doesn't have that steady stream of fuel from food, so it has to get creative.
Ah, so it starts looking for other sources of energy.
Exactly. It's like flipping a switch and saying, hey, cells, resources are low, time to get resourceful.
So could this cellular cleaning, this autophagy, actually protect nerve cells from the damage that happens in MS?
That's what researchers are trying to figure out. Some studies suggest it might help clear out those misfolded proteins, damaged mitochondria, that kind of stuff. And that could be really good news for folks with neurodegenerative diseases like MS.
Fascinating. Like giving those cells the tools to heal and protect themselves. But autophagy isn't the only thing that might be happening here, right? What about insulin?
Right. Another interesting avenue of research is looking at how fasting affects insulin sensitivity. You know, insulin is a key hormone for regulating blood sugar.
Yeah. And a lot of those sources talked about how insulin resistance is a problem in a lot of chronic diseases, MS included.
Exactly. So the thinking is if we can improve insulin sensitivity, through fasting, that might help reduce some of the harmful effects of insulin resistance.
Okay, I'm following you. But what does fasting actually do to insulin?
Well, imagine this. When you're eating all the time, your body is constantly working to process that food, keeping your blood sugar stable. Fasting gives your system a break. Insulin levels drop. And when that happens, your cells become more sensitive to insulin signals.
So it's like resetting the system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And for someone with MS, could that improved sensitivity actually help them?
There's some evidence to suggest it might. Some research indicates that insulin resistance itself might actually contribute to the inflammation and nerve damage that happens in MS. So if we can improve that sensitivity through fasting, it's possible we could reduce those negative effects.
Okay, so it's all starting to connect. We've got this autophagy happening, improved insulin sensitivity, those changes in the gut microbiome we talked about earlier, even the hormonal shifts, and all of these different pathways potentially working together to fight inflammation and protect those nerve cells.
Exactly. And what's really exciting about intermittent fasting is it's a relatively simple lifestyle change, but it has the potential to affect so many different aspects of our health.
But we have to remember, and you've said this a few times, this research is still pretty new, especially when we're talking about MS.
For sure, the early findings are very promising, but we need more research to really understand those long-term effects. Figure out the optimal protocols for different people, make sure we're not missing any potential risks or downsides.
And of course, talking to your doctor before making any big dietary changes. Especially if you have a condition like MS, that's non-negotiable.
Couldn't agree more. Your doctor can help personalize your approach, make sure fasting is safe for you. Because one size doesn't fit all, right?
Right. Okay, so we've got the science of fasting, the importance of personalized care. But you know what I'm really curious about?
What's that?
You mentioned earlier those forum posts about Muslims with MS and their experiences during Ramadan.
Oh, yeah.
And it got me thinking, the sources we've looked at mostly focus on the physical effects of fasting.
Right.
But could there be more to it than that?
More to it.
Yeah. Like, what about the mental and emotional side of things? The spiritual aspect even. Could that have an impact, especially for someone with MS?
That's a really fascinating question. I mean, fasting has been a spiritual practice for centuries, right, in so many cultures and religions. And it's often associated with things like discipline, self-reflection, connecting with something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. And I just wonder, could those elements play a role too, beyond just the biology?
I think it's definitely possible. Could that mental and emotional discipline, that focus that comes with fasting, could that lead to a greater sense of empowerment, maybe even a feeling of control?
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with a disease like MS, where so much feels out of your control.
Exactly. And what about that spiritual connection? Could that mean a sense of comfort or meaning, a source of strength or hope?
I think it's worth exploring. I mean, the research is mostly looking at the physical effects right now, but it feels like there's this whole other dimension we're just starting to tap into.
I agree. Like the intersection of fasting, psychology, spirituality, and how that all plays out for someone with a chronic illness.
Right. It makes you think about how we try to separate the physical, mental, and spiritual parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
But they're all connected.
They really are.
Maybe fasting, with its long history and all its different effects, maybe that's one way to bring those pieces back together.
To kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, and maybe that's part of what people are finding so powerful about it,
That makes sense.
It brings us back to those forum discussions, those personal stories. It really highlights how individual this whole experience is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, some people try fasting and it doesn't do anything for them.
Right, or they even feel worse.
Yeah. And I think that's a good reminder that what works for one person might not work for everyone.
Absolutely. So it's about listening to your body, being open to adjusting things.
Right. And having that open communication with your doctor, trying things out, seeing what works for you.
It's your journey, ultimately.
Right.
And it's not just about the physical symptoms either, right?
Right.
These forum posts, there's a lot of talk about the emotional burden of living with MS, the mental toll it takes.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, MS is a really tough disease to deal with, physically and emotionally.
People talk about feeling isolated, overwhelmed, worried about what the future holds.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So even if fasting could help, it's not always easy to take on something new when you're already feeling drained.
Especially when it requires discipline, changes to your routine, that can feel overwhelming.
And that's where support comes in. Family, friends, A good medical team,
Absolutely. Even online forums like the ones you shared,
right?
just connecting with others who get it, that can make such a big difference.
It does. And all this talk about fasting and lifestyle changes, maybe think about something else you mentioned, stem cell therapy.
Ah, yeah, I was just reading about that. It was in one of the sources you sent over. Really cutting edge stuff.
It is. And even though it's still early, there's so much hope surrounding it.
For good reason. The idea that we could use stem cells to actually repair that damaged myelin, maybe even promote new nerve growth, that's pretty incredible.
It is. Instead of just slowing the disease down, this could potentially reverse some of the damage that's already happened.
That's the hope, and some of the early results are pretty encouraging.
It's amazing to think how far we've come.
I know, it's really exciting to see all the different avenues researchers are exploring, from fasting to stem cells and everything in between.
It feels like there's a real shift happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're not just managing symptoms anymore. We're talking about actually healing, tapping into the body's own power to repair itself.
I think you're right, and that shift is happening because we're starting to see the connections,
Yeah,
between our bodies, our minds, our spirits. Healing isn't just about addressing the physical stuff, it's about the whole person.
it is. And that brings us back to those personal stories, the resilience of people living with MS.
Yeah.
They're not just passively waiting for a cure. They're actively searching for ways to improve their lives.
And trying new things, taking control. It's really inspiring.
It is. Well, expert, I have to say this has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for walking us through this.
It's been my pleasure. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff.
And to our listeners, thanks for coming along on this journey with us.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope you found it informative and maybe even inspiring.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will spark some new ideas or give you the courage to try something new.
That's what it's all about. And until next time, keep on diving.